Hello viewers, thank you for joining me. There is one more longer series that's been requested to me that I'll be jumping into next, but I wanted to slip in something short between them. First Code Geass, now Anohana. I'm starting to think this might be the year where I finally start getting to all the series that I've been hearing about for years, instead of jumping into things on a whim like I usually do. As just a few housekeeping notes, though I want to discuss this series as a whole, I don't plan to get too detailed with any spoilers. It wasn't the type of show that had a bunch of crazy plot twists or anything. Once you know the basic premise of the story, I think it's pretty obvious how it's going to play out in the end. It's the promise of the journey getting there that draws people in. And branching off from that, Anohana is the story of a group of childhood friends who grow apart after one of them dies in an accident, and their struggle to come back together after the spirit of that friend starts haunting one of them 5 years later. They all had nicknames as kids, and then of course they've got their real names, and because they're not close anymore, most of them have started calling each other by their surnames in the present day. To avoid confusion, I tried to stick to just one, and with the exception of Jinta, our main protagonist, what stuck for me were the nicknames. So, 5 years after the death of his friend Menma, Jinta starts seeing her following him around his house. At first he thinks he's hallucinating and blames it on the summer heat, but Menma is very real and not going anywhere. One of the things that really stood out to me right away was that, though no one else can see or hear her, Menma has no trouble interacting with physical objects around Jinta's house. She can open doors and eat real food and play with his old games like any living person could. If she runs into another person, they'll feel it and be knocked back, but either because it literally feels different or because their minds are quick to rationalize it away, they tend to blame it on a strong gust of wind or something. I'm drawn to a lot of stories about ghosts or spirits, and this was very different from the way I usually see it portrayed. That wasn't always a good thing, but I'll come back to that. Having such a strong presence still means Menma could potentially be a real nuisance in his life, but she's honestly got fewer opportunities with Jinta than she would if she was haunting one of her other friends. Jinta used to be the ringleader of their little group. He was confident and outgoing and a bit of a daredevil. Since Menma's death, he's grown up to be really withdrawn and insecure. He rarely leaves the house anymore and has stopped going to school altogether. Though it's not so clearly the focus here in Anohana, it actually reminded me a lot of Shoya from A Silent Voice. The contrast between his past and present really drew me in right away. Anyway, it's not quite that Jinta's desperate to get rid of her because she's causing problems. Once he accepts that Menma's spirit really has come back to him, he decides it's because her soul must not be at peace, and he wants to do whatever he can to let her finally rest. Which is easier said than done, of course. Menma has vague memories of a wish that needed to be granted, but has no idea what the wish actually was. The only thing she's sure of is that they all need to be together to accomplish it. Which is the other problem, because to say they've grown apart feels like a bit of an understatement. I'd say Jinta's at one end of this spectrum, and Yukiatsu and Tsuruko are at the other. They're the two honor students, the ones who refocused their grief and went on to get into this rigorous prep school, something they both hold over the others' heads at various points and use to look down on them. With different motivations, though. There are a lot of love triangles connecting this group, which I usually try not to linger on, but are impossible to ignore completely. Yukiatsu always resented Jinta's leadership, and they're very different and both have pretty strong personalities, so they would have clashed anyway, but it was mostly because they both had a crush on Menma. And though she's usually very reserved, whenever Tsuruko lashes out, she has a different target. You'll notice these two are the only ones who've stuck together, and that's basically because Tsuruko's been following along after him all this time. And I hate to even describe it like that, because they've all got strong personalities and their own motivations and insecurities, good and bad points. It does a disservice to Tsuruko to make her sound like just another lovesick anime girl. But a lot of the time it felt like the romances were the most prominent aspects of each of their characters. She and Yukiatsu were always the closest, but he didn't return her crush. She always suspected that even if Menma wasn't around, his second choice would have been their other friend, Anaru. If Jinta and the honor students are at opposite ends, I'd say Anaru is somewhere close to the middle. She's not exactly a model student, but at least she's still going to school. Her new friends are shallow and judgmental, but she hasn't closed herself off from the world completely. When Tsuruko goes after her, it's usually for not having a mind of her own and being too dependent on the people around her. And some of it may be because she's the first of Jinta's friends whose head we really get into, but I felt like I really connected with Anaru. She doesn't try to argue with Tsuruko about any of that. She's very aware of her own shortcomings. She just doesn't feel empowered enough to try and improve herself just yet. And getting to know Anaru made me realize that all of Menma's old friends feel guilty about her death for some reason. Anaru had a love triangle of her own. She was in love with Jinta. The day Menma died, she confronted him about his feelings for Menma in front of all their friends, and he reacts like most 10-year-old boys would. He gets embarrassed, lashes out, and then runs out of their secret base. And that's the last time he ever sees her alive, because Menma runs after him, trips and falls down the mountain, and drowns in the river below. Like every other character in this show, actually, Anaru never got over her crush, and takes Jinta's transformation kind of hard. She's a bit of a tsundere, so she's more likely to snap at him about it than tell him she's worried about him, but it's definitely one of the reasons she's the first he reconnects with. And when he goes up to revisit their old secret base, he runs into the last member of their little crew. Popo is probably my favorite character in the whole show, and they've all got their little intricacies that made them special. He's just a really free spirit. I think he was a bit younger than the rest, and he hung on everything Jinta said and did. This was the first group he ever really fit into, so he had an especially hard time moving on after the group fell apart. In fact, he never really did. He dropped out of school and now travels around working odd jobs, but whenever he's back in his hometown, he stays at their secret base. There's actually something much darker about this behavior, and of all the guilt-ridden secrets, Popo's is the one that almost broke me, but I'll leave that alone for this review. Being stuck in the past like this generally made him a very fun character, and it was really a nice change of pace to have at least one person who believed everything Jinta said without question. And because Popo is still as outgoing as he ever was, he's the real driving force behind getting them all back together, not being even a little fazed when he doesn't receive the warmest welcome from some of them. But they do all get back together, though not all completely believing him at first, and agree to try and figure out Menma's wish. There are a few things that they try that end up having no effect on her, but which help them all grow a little closer, of course. But ultimately they remember a plan they had as kids to make a rocket. It was actually the sweetest, cutest little kid thing I'd heard in a long time. At this same time, Jinta's mom was in the final stages of cancer and had moved pretty permanently into the hospital. Jinta had a hard time visiting her when it was just him and his dad. He was at that age where he could definitely comprehend her impending death, but couldn't face the emotions that go along with it, so he and his friends would go as a group and call to her through her window from the outside. They were going to send the rocket up with letters to God, asking him to cure Jinta's mom, but of course they never got that far. And now, as teenagers, they find that it's actually quite hard to make their own fireworks, particularly when they run into the laws around handling gunpowder. This is almost where the dream dies, until Menma finally convinces them all that she really has come back as a ghost, by writing a new entry in her diary while they're all at the secret base together. And this is where that physical presence of hers was a little frustrating to me. There's really just no reason it should have taken this long to have this moment. This was the end of episode 8 out of only 11 for reference. I kind of mentioned it before. It just felt too easy for Menma to interact with the living world around her for it to have been a struggle to prove that she was really here. When she's literally baking bread while they all sit in the next room, the fact that they can't see or hear her starts to feel really trivial. But I get the storytelling behind it at least. There are a lot of personal conflicts in Anohana, not a lot of big plot ones. There needed to be something that was pulled out almost until the end. Something that would kickstart that final stage of the story. And it doesn't feel quite right to me that that something was the gang finally accepting Menma was really there with them, but no point in continuing to linger on that now. Now that they're all on board, it gives them the motivation to convince the right people to help them, and they get their rocket built and have their big moment where they launch it, only to find that this wasn't the wish needed to help Menma move on either. I want to say that, as a whole, I get why Anohana is always up there when people make lists of the anime that make them emotional. Personally, there was only one scene where this show almost brought me to tears, and it wasn't the scene where Menma finally moves on, actually. I think I've made it pretty clear by now how much I love a good, sappy friendship story with a dark past. Anohana had all the makings to be perfect for me, and all of the characters are interesting, and their flaws are relatable enough to smooth things out for the ones who aren't as immediately likable as the others. Like Yukiyatsu, he's kind of an uppity jerk all the way through. I've never seen anyone project their own insecurities onto other people and then judge them for it quite as skillfully as this boy. Yet, at the end of it all, he doesn't stand out as the one character I could never get attached to or anything. I did really like them all. I just wish those insecurities they all have were discussed a little more thoroughly. The very last episode is fantastic from start to finish. It starts out with the big confrontation scene I was waiting for practically since the very first episode. At first, they're just getting together to talk about why the rocket plan didn't work, and decide it's because they all went into it with selfish intentions. But it slowly moves on to them all finally being open about each of their darkest secrets, and that was the most emotional scene in the series for me. I really wish it had been stretched out a bit through a bunch of smaller moments throughout the series. It just teases at it over and over again. Yukiyatsu actually has 2 big breakdown moments before this one, and it just feels like they were constantly dancing around the things that really needed to be said. And so the big scene where it all finally comes out was powerful, but far too short. I don't know, I just feel like there's a few steps in between being so subtle that your audience has to fill in the blanks themselves, and hitting them over the head with your points. And as far as the character stories went, Anohana wasn't quite in that perfect middle ground. But I did really enjoy this anime. It looked and sounded beautiful. It's got one of my favorite openings of all the anime I've ever seen. It had a great underlying story and characters who maybe could have been explored a little more, but the depth is there. I'm not surprised everyone I've ever heard talk about Anohana had nothing but praise for it. It's a really great portrayal of friendship and grief. It's almost a decade old by this point, but if anyone else still hasn't seen it, I suggest you do. Thank you for watching.